we have with China. On the one hand, China is to be punished for unfair trade practices and intellectual theft, currency manipulation, and the like. On the other hand, if the second most powerful economy in the world falters, that has a ripple effect throughout the international economic system, including the United States. We're not insulated from China faltering.
Don't let the Republicans hear you say that.
Well, so there's this interesting piece in Forbes about China's $13 trillion problem that's becoming everyone's problem. And it's not like the U.S. doesn't have problems that number in the trillions, too, like our unfunded entitlements and $23 trillion in debt. We'll get to it all with William Pesek, who is a Tokyo-based journalist, former columnist for Barron's and Bloomberg, author of the book Japanization, What the World Can Learn from Japan's Lost Decades. And he has written about China recently, so we get his insights on that. William, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So I guess, see, if am I asking the right question when I say, can we continue this love-hate relationship with China as it pertains to trade specifically and human rights secondarily, while still wanting to prop them up for our own interests?
I mean, the answer is yes, we can, unfortunately, because I think in the year ahead, we will see more clashes between the U.S. and China. I think what you're seeing from the Trump administration is, despite the economic fallout, I think President Trump thinks this has been a winner for him. And we are seeing China and the U.S. negotiating this phase one deal, which doesn't change the underlying dynamics between the U.S. and China. It doesn't change the underlying problems. In your intro, you mentioned intellectual property rights. It doesn't make China a fairer trader when it comes to nations. And so what we're doing at the moment is we're treating the symptoms of the problem, not the underlying causes. And as President Trump sits down with China and starts talking about those underlying causes, I think we'll see more trade wars, not less.
William, I'm one of those pesky capitalists, and I believe the only way to restrain totalitarian government is through the freedom of the citizens. So in my estimation, we've taken the exact wrong approach. I felt that China was being weakened by our trade, not strengthened, and weakened by their currency manipulation, not strengthened. As you see this acceptance and more of a populism growth around the world, do you think that totalitarian governments now are just the future, or is there a way to breed freedom?
Well, I think where China is concerned, I mean, I've been in Asia for almost 20 years now, and I'm one of those naive souls that 20 years ago would have argued that the internet, capitalism, would change China. We've seen the opposite. China has changed the internet. China has changed capitalism. And I think that China is seeing its so-called Beijing consensus as a good alternative to the Washington consensus that the world has been based on these last 20 or 30 years. And I think what we've seen is China is still kind of bending the capitalist system to its benefit. We are seeing a kind of illiberal capitalism in China. And I'm not sure that that will change in the year ahead. I think, I agree with the premise of your question in that, Donald Trump certainly has diagnosed the problem. I just quibble with his answer. I think that the trade war that he's been waging for the last 2 years is something that might have worked in 1985. It worked with Japan to some extent in the 1980s and the 1990s, but in a globalized world, when you're dealing with an economy as large as China and one that is as symbiotic to the U.S. To U.S. prosperity as China, it's a very, very different animal. And I'm not sure that the Trump White House gets the extent to which it has actually strengthened Xi Jinping's hand and not weakened it.
I want to go back to something George W. Bush once said. He used to say when he met with world leaders, he would ask them a single question. He would ask all of them at least this single question, which is, what keeps you up at night? And his answer from the Chinese president at the time was 20 million jobs. 20 million jobs annually. I need to create 20 million jobs every year in order to essentially preserve the regime, to prevent unrest. And I wonder if that's still the case. I wonder if there's any possibility that the revolt going on in Hong Kong has any prospect of reaching the mainland anytime soon.
Well, I think the problem is, I would look at the problem from a different angle, in that we often think of President Xi Jinping as being the strongest Chinese leader in generations. But think dramas in Hong Kong have shown his lack of omnipotence, if you will. It's shown the cracks of sort of the limits of his influence and the limits of his power. And I know that China's trying very, very hard to keep news from Hong Kong out of the mainland as best possible. But it is, in many ways, an embarrassment for the Chinese government at this point to see these protests going on for so long and to see the innovation with which the protesters are acting. And it's a very interesting dynamic for China.
You know, as they were advancing with the trade war on China, I was optimistic, hoping that they would open up the freer trade with the other Asian countries, and that to replace the detriment to our supply chain, there would be more trade from both Europe and other Asian countries. Instead, haven't they clamped that down as well? How does that look from your position of the world?
I mean, they have. That is a good point. I mean, the one silver lining, if you will, looking forward, is in the last week you've seen the Prime Minister of Japan meet with the presidents of China and South Korea. And that's a very, very rare trilateral summit, if you will. And I think it speaks to the extent to which the trade war is driving these Asian rivals together to some extent. I think that China and Japan and South Korea at the moment are putting aside some of their longer-running feuds, and they're realizing the extent to which they have to work together in the couple of years ahead to stabilize the region, stabilize economies. And I think that they're realizing where, certainly the target of the trade war is China, but Japan and South Korea have experienced very, very serious collateral damage. And as something else that's been going on, which is kind of interesting, is as President Trump has pivoted away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China is actually reaching out to a variety of countries around the region on a bilateral basis, to India, even Japan and South Korea. And so I think that's something that once the White House takes a deep breath and looks at that dynamic, they won't like that very much.
Yeah, but at the same time, at least according to the export data I've seen, we've seen significant spikes in exports to markets like Vietnam and Singapore as some companies are readjusting their supply chains away from China.
Exactly, and Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand. But also, I think the Trump administration is realizing that as well, and they've begun to, in some way, threaten Vietnam with sanctions as well. And you see that the Trump administration is also clamping down on a variety of countries in Asia, including Singapore, on currency grounds. So I think that's kind of an area to watch in the year ahead. Will Donald Trump add a currency war onto the trade war we've been seeing for the last couple of years? And I really do think that anyone who thinks that this kind of truce that you've seen at the end of this year between China and the U.S. is going to hold, I have my doubts.
I want to get to something else, too, just maybe another crack in the communist regime in China, and that is the international attention, not probably what it deserves to be, but some at least, on their persecution of the Uyghur Muslim minorities there, what are described in painstaking detail as concentration camps. And I wonder if that could be something that is destabilizing as the world says to China, that we're not going to tolerate you persecuting people like that.
I think that's the wild card for 2020. I mean, I think that in recent days when the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and China got together, there was an effort to raise the issue, but also an effort to not upset China to a great extent. The the Trump administration has been a bit inconsistent in their response to this. They've, on the one hand, spoken out against it from the State Department. On the other hand, the White House specifically has been pretty quiet. But I think that 2019 has been a difficult year for China's soft power. Part of the problem is Hong Kong. Part of the problem is the Uyghur issue that you're just referring to. And the other issue is Taiwan. Taiwan has an election coming up in January. And 6 months ago, basically the incumbent president was about neck and neck in the polls, and now she's pulling ahead. And so in some ways, what China is doing in Hong Kong is backfiring. Taiwanese are looking at this and saying, no thanks.
I started out by referencing a piece you wrote about China's $13 trillion problem. That's its onshore bond market. I want to give you an opportunity to describe what that $13 trillion problem is and what its potential relevance to America is.
Well, when you look at every financial crisis since the 1970s, they've all started in the debt market. Latin America in the 80s, Asia in the 90s, Wall Street in the 2000s. And when you look at, economists talk about this Minsky moment. That's when a debt and credit-fueled growth spurt ends badly. And the question is when China reaches that point. Will 2020 be that year? I'm not really sure, but when you look at the kind of credit increase we've seen over the last 10 years, China now has about $30 trillion U.S. in credit it's built up in the last decade rather. The onshore debt defaults have reached about $20 billion this year. Overall defaults are about $75 billion this year. Those aren't huge numbers for an economy China's size, but you've got about $200 billion of corporate debt maturing in the next 2 years. And then you have all these off-balance sheet vehicles. So in many ways, the opacity that is inherent to China means we really don't know the size of the debt problem. So when China does have this reckoning, the way Latin America did, the way Asia did, the way Wall Street did, every industrializing nation has this problem. When China hits a wall, it's going to come very suddenly, and it'll take the world by surprise.
So, William, the same could be said for America. We've got this massive, I mean, ours, we dwarf them. And here's been my concern, what I've been watching since we've done this, is that the enemies, the economic enemies of America, have somewhat come together. And my big fear is that the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Iranians form their own sort of new hybrid currency. If that were to happen, will I be able to live through the apocalypse, or should I just buy my jumpsuit now?
I often think I should also buy a farm in New Zealand and prepare for the worst. But yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. I think the nearer term problem, the problem in the nearer term, is the fact that America's bankers are in Asia. You know, Japan and China and South Korea and India together hold something like $2.5 trillion of U.S. treasuries. They could make quite a statement to the U.S. government at some point by not even selling those debt instruments, but just slowing their purchases. And so that could certainly happen. And I think that, you know, Donald Trump has been talking about how the dollar is too strong for a long time. If 2020 is the year in which he decides to start putting the moves on the dollar, he's already gone after the Federal Reserve, that is the reserve currency. That is the linchpin of the global financial system. And at what point do countries like China, Russia, Iran, do they get together and say, look, we just cannot be beholden to the U.S. to this extent because we can't trust Washington anymore? I mean, this might be a bit of an extreme view on my part, but I do think it's something we have to watch out for. It's one of those things where, you know, be careful what you wish for.
William Pesek is a Tokyo-based journalist, former columnist for Barron's and Bloomberg, author of Japanization, What We Can Learn from Japan's Lost Decades, and check out his piece in Forbes, which I'll tweet out, about China's $13 trillion problem he was just describing. William Pesek, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, gents.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one.